being run by this mentor of hers, Father Bulatao.
In Ateneo.
In Ateneo. And it
Who
was...
we think of as the Elementos guy.
Well, yes, among other things. I didn't have a personal relationship with Father Bulatao. And then she said it was a hypnosis class. And I said, great.
So you took a hypnosis class?
Yeah, I took it for, I think, around 2 months over this summer.
As in, they teach you how to put people under?
Yeah.
So
Even
how do I know that you are not hypnotizing me right now?
No, your state of consciousness is not altered.
The world has gone bonkers. We now live in George Orwell's 1984. War is peace, ignorance is strength, and crazy is normal. How do you stay sane? Marika Melgar is a practicing clinical psychologist who provides therapy for a variety of mental issues and disorders. Hi Marika, thanks for coming. I know that a lot of people would like to experience going to therapy, but they have these fears, as in, about how the whole experience will be. Could you walk us through what a consultation is like? As in, is there a couch?
Actually, if you look at your space here, it kind of reminds me of my clinic. I sit over here, client sits over here, I have a nice white couch, I have plants, I have a rug. So actually, this whole space reminds me of a clinic, my own.
So our production designer has done it right. Yes.
Maybe he went to therapy.
Yes. What then? Do you ask them questions, or are they just supposed to start talking?
So generally, it begins with what I call an intake interview, and you'll be asked to attend that as your initial session.
So what happens in an intake interview?
This is an actual form that I ask clients to fill out before I talk to them. So it's really extensive history taking. And then what are you currently experiencing? So what's the problem in your eyes?
So is the point to construct a kind of profile of the...
In a way, the way detectives try to construct a profile of, let's say, a perpetrator. You're trying to build a story of what a person might be, even though you've only met once.
This is closer to what I had expected therapy would be like, because I've been disappointed in recent years when I ask my friends who go to therapy. I say, what's it like? Oh, they prescribe antidepressants. What?
Right.
I'm not going to lie on a couch and start talking about my childhood.
I guess different therapists come from different paradigms. They might have gone to psychiatrists. And some psychiatrists don't do talk therapy, and they're pretty straightforward if they don't. But there are psychiatrists who do it.
Yeah.
So I guess if you're a consumer or a client, you have to ask.
You have to ask, are you the talk kind
you're gonna talk
or
to
the
me
prescription kind?
Yeah, or give me pills. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because some people, they want to go to a psychiatrist for their medication and go to another therapist for their talk therapy. So I work with some psychiatrists. They don't necessarily talk to the client or the patient, because the client prefers to go to me for the therapy part and then to go back to the doctor for the medication part.
I was overjoyed to hear that your college course was comparative literature.
It's Anglo-American literature.
Anglo-American literature. So and I was a comparative literature major. So it's like, wow, there's a practical use for having read all those books.
I didn't know it at the time.
How did you go from Anglo-American literature to clinical psychology?
So I did what most early 20s kids would do, which is to be in a job they hated. So I was a researcher for a business firm, but it's not that it's not the thing you want to do for the rest of your life.
Yes.
So there was a very long period of just being lost. I think my mom had felt I was getting a little bit lost. I guess moms just know.
Yes.
She incidentally is a psychologist as well. And she suggested that I just drop in for a seminar over the summer, being run by this mentor of hers, Father Bulatao.
In Ateneo.
In Ateneo. And
who we think of as the Elementos guy.
Well, yes, among other things. I didn't have a personal relationship with Father Bulatao. And then she said it was a hypnosis class. And I said, great.
So you took a hypnosis class?
Yeah, I took it for, I think, around 2 months over this summer.
As in, they teach you how to put people under?
Yeah.
So how do I know that you are not hypnotizing me right now?
No, your state of consciousness is not altered at this moment. And so I went in there with a bunch of other non-psych people. And these non-psych people were just interested to learn from Father Bulatao. And so that had went on for, I think, 2 months. And there were things that he did in there that just sort of, made those tectonic shifts. And after that, I had such a great interest to know more about psychology in general. So I left my MBA program after a year, and then I enrolled in psychology following that seminar. And the rest is history.
So in hypnosis class, can you really put people under? As in, are there people who are more prone to be hypnotized and people who just can't be?
Yeah, they say that there are some people who are more likely susceptible to be in altered states of consciousness. There are a lot of my colleagues who have done this as therapeutic tools for their clients. But it doesn't work for everyone, and that's all right. What matters is for those that it does work on, it helps them.
What made you decide to become a consulting clinical psychologist in particular?
So while I was in the program, I learned about a couple of things. The first being a lot of psychologists teach. They stay in the university. And at the time, there were not a lot of clinics. And even until now, it's still emerging,
I think in the past, it was because there was some kind of stigma to seeking therapy. It's like, it's because people are bonkers, so they have to go to a therapist.
Right.
Although now, it's like, mayayaman lang ang kailangan ng therapy. Walang ganyan sa mahihirap. A lot of people say, yeah.
Because how much is therapy? It's prohibitive. Maybe the cost of a session is at least 1,000, 2,000. If you go to a psychiatrist, maybe even more. And that's for one session.
Yeah, one session.
So if you're earning 20,000 a month, that's already 10%.
And I don't suppose health cards cover therapy.
Well, we're waiting for the new Mental Health Act and to see how it's going to be implemented. I think the good news here is that there might be benefits, or I think there will be benefits for card holders eventually, but I have not seen the implementing rules and regulations, but that's a real bright spot.
Yes, and no doubt, some genius is going to say, it's going to be taken advantage of. People will pretend to have problems.
Exactly.
Can you do that? As in, can you be fooled?
That's part of, I guess, it's the cost of providing a service to the country. I know in PWD cards, a lot of people can get that fairly easily.
Yes.
And they're able to access discounts on services that people with disabilities really need. So there would be that part of the population that would perhaps abuse. But if it's under the law, there's really no way to
Are you
not
kidding?
give that.
I hear there's a thriving black market in senior citizen IDs.
And you can't refuse that if you're presented with a card, because that's under the law. How to enforce the forgers and so on, I guess it's a larger debate on how to do that. But a lot of the work now that I'm doing and other people are doing is we're bringing it down to communities.
Yes.
So we're getting funding internationally, and we're bringing down programs to the poorest of the poor, those who earn less than 10,000 a month, and we're bringing these programs with some funding to make it accessible in a way. So it's a slow start, but at least it's a start.
Just from personal observation, I find that the rates there seems to be more depressed people these days. As in, that's just from personal observation. And then when I Googled a bit, I found out that it's like epidemic proportions. Is it just because we're more aware of it that that we register these things happening, or has this always been the case and then we finally learn to pay attention?
Well, depression afflicts a huge portion of the population, that's for sure. I think in the Philippines at some points 3% of the population is suffering with depression. But there's also now people seeking more help than before.
Right.
So perhaps before, if you had depression, you would go to your church, you'd go to your family,
or you would
go
keep
to
it to
your friends,
yourself
or keep it
because
to
you would
yourself.
keep
Yeah.
it as you would see it as a sign of weakness
Right.
that you don't want to admit to.
Right. So even until now, some people cannot admit, let's say, that they need help if they're dealing with a mental health issue. Although I'm seeing more from a younger generation in the wake of social media,
Right.
technology, normalizing mental health or mental illness is going in that direction, that it's okay not to hide. But there is real consequence. It's not as easy to say, oh, let's just destigmatize. Because if you've ever been in a situation wherein you tried to tell somebody you're dealing with something and they simply didn't understand, it becomes, at that personal level, very relatable. That stigma is real.
Oh, wait, I forgot to offer you a drink. Can we get you something to drink?
Water
Okay.
for me. Thank you.
Please, Gamba.
Gamba with 6 abs, so thank you.
Yes. So, how can you tell if a person is depressed? As in, how can you tell if you yourself are depressed?
So if you come in, let's say, to a professional for an assessment, there might be these 9 things that a professional might look at.
Okay.
I call it MSIGA-CAPS. Well, I learned this from listening to other mental health professionals. So the first is mood. Are you persistently feeling sad and upset?
Okay.
And there's normally a period of time wherein a professional might look into that. Letter S is sleep. Have you been sleeping well? Or have you been waking up at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. for a couple of weeks now and not being able to have
So
healthy
lack of sleep. Is too much sleep also a problem?
I've had clients who've had too much sleep and they're awake at odd hours in the morning, and then maybe they're just awake for 4 hours and then they have to
Okay,
go
good.
back to sleep again.
My excessive sleep patterns are not a problem. It's just that I'm turning into my cats. Okay. And then what's I?
All right. I is interest. Have you suddenly lost interest in the things that you used to like? Like if you were to not be interested in cats anymore, and that happens for some people too. The things they used to find pleasure in, they can't find pleasure in anymore.
Okay.
G is feelings of guilt or worthlessness. Do you feel that life is hopeless, that you're hopeless, that you are at fault, or you are failing in aspects of your life?
Okay.
Letter E is energy. Have you been so lethargic lately? It takes somebody to drag you out of bed. I had an older client who was like a grandfather who simply, even as he sat there, it was like I was talking to a chair, with lips moving, but not much else. I knew that it was probably difficult to just sit there and talk to me.
Right.
And you could sense that vibrating energy. It was simply just not there. C is your concentration. Especially at work, you might notice if you're finding it hard to do things that normally would be quick for you. Deliverables that you could just churn at the snap of a finger, perhaps now
Suddenly it's difficult.
Yeah, and you end up calling in sick because you simply cannot work.
You can't deal.
Or focus on school for some kids. A is your appetite. Some people lose weight drastically. And so some doctors might take a look at that. If you've been dropping pounds all of a sudden, nangangayayat,
and they're not on some sort of diet and exercise
and they're not
regimen.
on Cohen diet, there's
Yeah.
nothing else to perhaps explain that. P is psychomotor retardation or
does that
agitation. This is how your body would probably tend to move somewhere, they're physically unable to move, let's say, from the bed. Or they get, less frequently, they get more agitated. And S is suicidality. Have you been thinking in the past weeks of ending your life, of ending it all, of hurting yourself? And so we look at how high of a risk are you for that. And normally I work with a psychiatrist if I sense that that is pretty high, because that also tells me that perhaps this client will benefit from medication. Aside from
that would be
therapy.
the urgent case where we had better medicate this person to prevent it from getting worse. So just from your mnemonic device, it tells me that we all know someone who is depressed.
Or you yourself.
Yes.
And sometimes you might not admit that to yourself as well.
Yes.
You're not going to see it. You may not identify as a mentally ill person. And so perhaps other people might be the one to take, put that arm around your shoulder and say to you.
Yeah, and it's ironic that everyone's going on about how connected we all are because of the social media, because of technology, but I find that people still need someone to talk to.
Everybody does.
Yes,
Yeah.
and social media is not doing it for them. In fact, I
Right.
suspect social media is just aggravating feelings of, depression, misery.
Yeah, there was a study recently done by a colleague of mine, and she looked at how social envy can increase those symptoms of depression.
Yeah, it's like
those that are
you're looking at another
some-
person's Instagram and
Yeah.
their life seems so fabulous, and then you start comparing your life.
Right, and your life is not enough because
Mm-hmm.
it's never enough. And if you have that thought that maybe, my life is not enough, I'm not enough compared to this, then you're likely to probably be depressed. Because
Mm-hmm.
some people do look at social media, but they don't get depressed about it.
Or they look to mock other people, which I
Sure.
find is the healthier.
Exactly. There's
Perspective.
humor in
Yes.
going into social media, or they can have a diet of social media. They don't have to be in it
Yes.
for long periods of time. So I think those who are potentially likely to be, to have social envy might want to taper down a bit.
How can you tell if a person is suicidal? As in,
Right.
especially if they're not very expressive and they're not going around announcing their intentions.
So in my experience, there might be that one way wherein it's quite obvious. A person goes into therapy and perhaps tells me, I have a plan, I picked out the things I need, or I have a date in my mind. And when that happens, there's a certain protocol that we follow that kicks in, We tell a loved one, we break that confidentiality agreement because in order to protect that client, we have to engage people
Yes.
who love this client. We sweep the surroundings, their house, and you don't leave the client, bantay sarado, for 24 hours at the very least. If it's really a case of emergency, we tell them no need to go to counseling. If you find her or him and she or he is in the throes of an attempt or whatever that may be, immediately bring to the hospital so that he or she can get psychiatric care.
Mm-hmm.
And a psychologist I was listening to earlier, one who wrote a book on suicide, he was saying that then maybe perhaps it can happen to anyone. There's always a trend wherein there are studies that say that 90% of people who kill themselves have a diagnosed mental illness. But really, when you look at things deeper, not everyone is diagnosed, or not everyone who kills themselves are diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
You simply will not know from the
and,
outside.
I heard somewhere that when the periods when a severely depressed person is suddenly very cheerful, it may be because they've decided on a specific date to end it all, and they're looking forward to the end of all this pain.
So it's a heartbreaking experience if you go to a funeral of somebody who died in this way.
Yeah, because everyone's sitting around thinking, what could I have done? Why didn't I see
Yeah,
this?
He or she looks so happy.
Yes.
Because it's not in the behavior sometimes, it's in the patterns of thought. So maybe the pattern of behavior is that he or she might have been going about his or her business normally, but her pattern or his pattern of thought is that I've already planned this. There are some personality traits they've looked at that perhaps bring people closer to this kind of decision. One of them is impulsivity. People who tend to be more impulsive, less rational in their actions. Another is aggression or aggressive behavior. And the other one is perfectionism. People who cannot accept that we
Mistakes,
will have
flaws. Yeah.
shortcomings because we're human. But of course, in the end, you know, there are more questions perhaps than answers. And so there has to be a way as well to communicate these things when they happen. I know that in the media there have been guidelines on how to report on
Yes,
suicide
for instance,
cases.
there's some kind of guideline that says do not mention cause of death in cases of suicide because it leads to copycats.
It's really hard to police that.
Yes.
And what you have to worry about is the contagion, that other people who hear about it or see it, they find that if they are vulnerable in that state, that there might be copycats, like you said, people following the incident
Yes.
who will have less inhibition to do that. I sat in a talk of Dr. Banaag Senior, which is an child and adolescent psychiatrist, and he was talking about his own experience in the ER in the wake following 13 Reasons Why.
Yes.
A lot of teens got admitted for suicide attempts or self-harm attempts.
Yeah, a friend of mine who had seen the series, because I haven't, said that the problem with it was that it has the whole "you'll be sorry when I'm dead" element, where somebody's death leads to results. So,
Or in some studies, they find that the promise, let's say, of people paying attention to you, giving you accolades when you're gone. If you're that vulnerable, it'll happen when I leave. You know, I'll finally get the care, the affection, the love that they didn't perhaps show me. You know? And if you're that vulnerable, you might believe that can happen to you after you die. And so I think there are a lot of parent advocates, media advocates, and mental health advocates who have now released certain guidelines for watching any show that has potential impact in this way. You know, how to not be sensationalist about headlines, for instance.
right.
Or giving access more to information for those seeking help.
Although, as with everything, a balance has to be found in this because some of those trigger warnings are really ridiculous. As in, they're assuming that we are all fragile people who would fall apart at the slightest problem.
So, you know, responsible citizenship is upon all of us. It's not just the showmakers, it's also parents who have kids, it's friends who care for friends. Avoidance is key sometimes. You know, if you know it's a show about, let's say, suicide or trauma, and you're going through that thing yourself, it's probably best not to get into that content. And there are some shows, I think, that treat mental health in a good way, in a balanced way.
So a lot of people are also not inclined to take seriously when someone talks about being suicidal because it could also be a call for attention. Right. As in, you know, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to kill myself and stuff like that. So how do you distinguish between was this mentioning suicide as a ploy for attention and, you know, a real problem?
This is tricky sometimes.
Yes.
My rule of thumb is to proceed with caution in any case. If it's a child, sometimes you might hear them say, "Oh,
yes."
And if they're young children, sometimes that they can mimic things they see on TV. And the real issue there might be is to teach the child how to express how he or she feels. He has or she has not yet all the words that one normally uses as an adult. So you might need to teach your child how to really tell you what he or she is feeling. But if you're not sure, and most of the time we're not sure whether that's a friend, that's your kid.
Yes.
For me, the prudent thing is to seek help, professional help, so that your child, spouse, friend can be seen by a mental health professional. On my side of the coin, we look at whether there is suicidal ideation, which is just the thought of killing oneself, but not necessarily going full blast or going to that end. So these are just thoughts. They would come and go, perhaps with some frequency. And we've had that perhaps at some point in our lives. You know, parang ayoko na, gusto ko na mamatay. And then if you're a therapist, you will have to now go deeper. You know, is there anything more to that? Are there self-harm behaviors that the person is doing? This is cutting.
Which I've always found that, why would you want to do that?
A professor that I recall always told me that there's psychological pain that needs to be expressed. But the person may not have the best way to do that. Either he or she does not know how to cope with the distress, or perhaps in his or her environment, it's very hard to do that. In some cases, it is a cry for help, meaning I want to be able to do this in another way, but I don't know how. And then there are those that may have had attempts in the past, the intention to end one's life, whether or not they actually had gone through with that, or whether or not they die from that. And so you have to check if there had been attempts as well in the past. So it's a complex way of investigating, but I wouldn't necessarily minimize that, because there is a function to that. Maybe for kids, you have to check, you know, naglalaro lang ba to?
Yeah, you have to take these things seriously.
Right, and it's a case-to-case basis, because maybe before it was just
it's
all
not
play.
some one-size-fits-all treatment. Yeah,
it's a boy cried wolf situation, but they're human. So maybe before they were just, you know, looking like they're being dramatic, but then you'll never know when that time might be. And so we take all those times with some caution and some prudence, and we really try to listen. What I find about mental health advocacy, and I'm really happy that it's being in now, you know, people are less afraid to be advocates. But there's a lot of advocacy about talking, you know, talk to somebody. But I think there also needs to be an advocacy about listening. Listening is hard. It's hard to empathize, for instance, to put yourself in the shoes of another kid.
Yeah, to listen to someone without immediately judging them and saying it. Yeah.
Nagdadrama ka lang.
Yes.
Ako na naman.
Yeah, or mag-shopping na lang tayo.
Right, or let's just go out to the bar.
Yes.
You know, or cigarettes, or whatever. And so listening is a skill, I think, that also people can advocate for. And it doesn't have to be that the person actually says anything. Silence, you know, listening to the silence is also listening. You're listening that it's hard, and you may not solve it for this person, but you can be there as a way to support yung pakikiramdam sa Filipino.
You're one of the authors of Beyond DSM, Casebook in Abnormal Psychology and Mental Health.
I co-edited this with 3 other editors. That would be Dr. Melgar, Cherilo, and Marika. And so these were written by graduate students and other professionals.
They're basically case studies.
Yes, they're actual people across the Philippines. They take a closer look about the person who has the mental illness rather than just the mental illness itself. What is it like for a person who has bipolar disorder? What was it like to care for a mother who loses her memory? You know, so we're looking at the experience of what it's like to deal with what most people would diagnose as a mental illness. And what we find is that it humanizes these illnesses. It brings a face, a family, a story to these things that people deal with. They're not just a statistic. So that when you find a way to help them, you're not just pulling out a textbook and then just doing what the textbook says.
And then earlier, our director and I were talking about how kids today, and I don't mean this just as a kids today general sweeping statement, but they seem a lot more fragile. As in, you know, it takes less to really make them sad or gloomy or suicidal.
Not sure what are the correlates to this, but one thing I'm thinking about is they grow up with technology. You know, being able to make a friend is now a choice between an iPad or going out to make friends, for instance, when they're young. you know, when you're growing up in this kind of generation wherein everything is fast, you're expected to learn fast, for instance. You can't fall behind nowadays.
So you expect some kind of instant gratification.
I think this generation, more than the others, are met with demands for speed, to instantly have friends, to instantly accomplish things. They have a lot of resources. There are no wars at the moment, save for political cold wars.
Which is why they break more easily, because speed is a requirement.
There's a lot of things you need to teach then about resilience. I'm not saying it's probably a direct line. You know, how do I teach him that, you know, even with YouTube and Wikipedia and all these resources, you're still gonna fail?
Yeah, and you mentioned grit. As in, how do parents teach that quality in an age where everyone judges their parenting skills and says, oh, that's child abuse?
Pressure
when
on
you
parents.
deny your children anything because, you know, that's supposed to teach them, to help them build character, others would say, you are depriving your children. That's a kind of abuse.
Now parenting has become less harsh, I would say. There is now more awareness about how to positively parent kids.
Yes.
I'm working on programs right now on that, along those lines, wherein we teach parents how to raise kids by teaching them how to spend more quality time, for instance. Teach your kids how to express feelings.
Right.
Teach your kids, praise them.
Yes, because it's just occurred to me that it's not a skill that's picked up in school.
No.
So the only thing you know is how you were brought up.
Exactly.
And if your parents were
Yes.
horrible parents, basically, that's what you're going to be to your own children.
And I hear that a lot. And you can't fault them, because that's how their parents perhaps,
Exactly.
you know, made them learn resilience and grit.
Yeah, so last question. Here's another term we hear a lot online. Self-care. What is that? What is self-care?
I like to think of self-care as a way to love yourself, you know, to have that compassion for yourself. Whether that be, for me, it's music, listening to a lot of music. For others, it's running. For others, it's emotional self-care, you know, saying no, for instance, knowing your own boundaries. That's also a way of feeling compassion for yourself. And sometimes I find that part is missing.
Right.
And a lot of people, they can take care of everyone, especially Filipinos.
Yes.
We love taking care of everyone, families, friends.
And even if we don't love it, we are required to.
Or that there is that high demand, you know, to be part of a community. Sometimes self-care is put in a bad light, you know, it's entitlement, it's being selfish.
Yeah, it's selfishness.
You're
yes.
spoiling yourself. But it's actually a way to maintain balance. Energy in, energy out. In mindfulness therapies, we take a look at how people have nourishing activities, for instance, and how many depleting activities they have in a day. So energy management, along with time management, but energy management is something we do so that we don't go insane. It's sanity maintenance.
Right. And so I
yeah.
guess it's a simple matter of finding something that makes you happy and doing it without feeling guilty, without judging yourself, and without trying to get rich off it.
Some people get rich out of their self-care, but at the end, internally, you have to feel rich.
Yes.
You have to feel that something went back to you, even as you give parts of yourself to all of these things that you do.
So thank you. It's been a very enlightening discussion.
Well, thank you
And
for
we
having
will
me.
have a part 2 sometime. Thank you very much.
You're very much welcome.